So our Torah portion today is called Pinchas. I know a lot of people will read that Phinehas, but it's Pinchas. And it begins in the 10th verse of Numbers chapter 25. And we're going to read a few of those verses today. So we'll read from verse 10 to verse 13. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the children of Israel, because he was zealous with my zeal among them, so that I did not consume the children of Israel in my zeal. Therefore say, behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and his descendants after him a covenant of everlasting priesthood, because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for the children of Israel. So this portion begins with a continuation of the actions that this man Pinchas took at the end of the previous Torah portion. And you will remember, I'm sure, that he took a javelin and he went and found Zimri and Cozbi, this Midianite woman, and run them through. They were apparently having relations near the door of the tent of meeting, and understanding that was basically flaunting their sin in God's face. Just daring him to do something, daring God to act. And then, of course, there's all these other things that are swirling around this, because they and others had been seduced to join these Midianite women and participate in this sin called the sin of Baal Peor, which then, of course, resulted in a plague that was sweeping through the camp as all of these things were going on. Now, we'll backtrack just a little bit on things that we've said before. But here is what the sin of Baal Peor was. Balaam could not curse what God had blessed, right? However, he devised a plan whereby Israel, being seduced, would bring a curse upon themselves. The plan included these beautiful daughters of Midian and Moab. And I always like to point this out, and not to be, trite, but there's a reason that in the beginning and here and throughout history that the adversary uses beautiful things to seduce God's people. He doesn't use homely things or ugly things. And what I'm getting at is he doesn't come wearing a red suit, carrying a pitchfork, and present all these ghastly things in order to seduce God's people. He always comes with something that presents itself as attractive and lovely and, good. So then that's how he seduced the children of Israel at Baal Peor. And then they joined themselves at this sacrificial meal that it was dedicated to the Baal of Peor. And in case there's some who don't know, Baal is not just the name of an idol. Baal, really, in Hebrew means husband. That's the idea behind it. That's why the Creator was so against and opposed the idea of his people worshiping these Baalim, because it was basically they who were betrothed to him, he their husband, they his prospective bride. They're basically going out and consorting with other lovers, finding another husband, and that's why he was so motivated to act. So this is what was going on, and we've discussed this particular kind of snare as the benefit of being God's people. Well, maybe that didn't come out the right way. The point being is, if we are God's people, then know for a certainty that the adversary is always going to be trying to present us with things that appear to be good, to lure us into this kind of snare. So now, we've also, in years past, when we come to this Torah portion, we talk about Pinchas or Phinehas' zeal, and how that's something to attain, to have this kind of zeal for God's house. I'm not suggesting that we should all go buy javelins and have them at our ready. That's not what we're saying here. But to have a zeal for God's house, to be infused with God's zeal. Because what we read is, rather than receiving condemnation from Moses and from God, he received a commendation from God. He's made a priest, and all those who would follow after him they were elevated to the role of being a priest. And why? Because he would not permit God's house to be disrespected in this manner. He would not allow God's house to be disrespected. So now I want to backtrack again to the previous portion to get some context here, just in case you've forgotten it from last week. But Numbers 25, beginning in verse 1. Now Israel remained in Acacia Grove. That's how it's rendered here in the New King James. And the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. And so Israel was joined, notice that word, to, let me put it this way, the husband of Peor, the Lord of Peor, this other god. And the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. And then the Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and hang the offenders before the Lord out in the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. And so Moses said to the judges of Israel, every one of you kill his men who were joined to the Baal Peor. That's no ambiguity there. Very clear instructions. Pretty intense, wouldn't you say? Pretty intense. Which then would lead me to conclude that the Creator who knows all things realizes that this kind of sin is obviously very corrosive, it's very corruptive, and it spreads very easily and very fast, and it must be put down very quickly. Why else would the God who is love administer such strict punishment if it were not deadly? So then, as a result of this, the people are assembling at the tabernacle and they're beginning to weep over the sin, or maybe they're weeping over the sin and the fact that they've got a pretty heavy task before them. They've been commissioned to go and take out these people who brought such a sin upon Israel. I've never been faced with anything that comes close to that. But since we've been here in Jacob's tent, Beth and I and other leadership in this congregation have been at times faced with some things that we don't particularly like, we don't want to have to do, and it is grievous, I will assure you. But I can't imagine what it must have been to those who were given the instruction to carry out this particular command. And I know that some people will read that and say, God's mean and he's this and he's that. God's holy. We have to remember that. So let's go to verse 6 now. And indeed, one of the children of Israel came and presented to his brethren a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Now when Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw it, he rose from among the congregation, he took a javelin in his hand, and he went after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her body. By the way, some commentators say that she was a Midianite princess. And so the plague was stopped among the children of Israel, and those who died in the plague were 24,000. So Pinchas does something, we might say, on Moses' behalf, certainly on God's behalf. It seems that way. And if you think about it, he did to Zimri what Moses had just told the leaders of the congregation to do to those who had been guilty of the sin of Baal Peor. Pretty much. But God doesn't punish him. He doesn't reprimand him. He rewards him. Even his other people among the congregation are going to bring accusations that he's a murderer, right? God doesn't look at it that way. Some people would see that this is murder because he appeared to act as judge, jury, and executioner. And yet God applauds, even rewards his actions. He commends his zeal. And I'll admit, that this is sometimes kind of hard to wrap my brain around. But when it doesn't make sense to me, I have to remember it's not because it doesn't make sense. The problem's not on that end, the problem's on this end. And so we have to be willing to just say, the Lord knows what he's doing. And if we really believe that he is the sovereign of all, then every decision he makes is just. Every decision he makes is righteous. Every decision he makes is true. Do we believe that? 3 of you do. Do we believe that? All right. Where Pinchas is concerned, in reality, more than taking lives, he saved lives. 24,000 people have died, more are going to die. If you were faced with that, really, if you were faced with that, don't you think you would do what you needed to do to save people's lives? Apples and oranges. I want to make certain I say this the correct way. Years ago, when people were investing in gold and silver and things like this, I decided to invest in lead. And it is one of those investments that I hope I never have to call on, right? But I'm determined that if my family's life is threatened, I will do what I have to do. Now, lest you think that that means that I'm encouraging people to take on the beast, I'm not. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that when my home or when your home is threatened, anybody worth his salt is going to do whatever he has to do to protect his family. Agreed? That same principle applies here. There is a reason that we invest so much in security. Because we believe the Father is our first line of defense. We believe that with our whole hearts. But then apparently there are things that we are compelled to do because of the day and age in which we live. And so if this congregation came under any kind of threat, there are people in this congregation who would do what they had to do for the sake of the lives of the people who are part of our family. I don't know why I'm telling you this, but I feel like I need to say that, okay? So that is the mindset, I believe, that we see in Pinchas. I don't think this man is someone who desired to do these things, but he saw what was happening to his family, and he decided to take action. 24,000 had already died. So I'm going to suggest to you that his zeal, a true zealot, a sincere zealot, is going to act on behalf of the whole, not to advance their own agenda, but to protect the interests of the whole. And so this man was not moved by envy, but he was moved to protect. And again, we see that God supported this action. And so because God supported it, we celebrate his zeal. Now, I want to briefly discuss those positive aspects of zeal. The Hebrew root word is kana, kuf, nun, aleph. And the wrong definition is there. Sorry. That does not mean to acquire. What this means is to protect ownership. So dismiss the to acquire part, okay? Actually, never mind. I see what you have. I see what happened. I see what I did. It was my mistake. Let's erase the last 30 seconds. Got it? Okay. Kuf nun aleph, kana. It means it's a word that means to protect ownership. And the idea here is to protect the ownership is alluding to having the interest of others in mind. Psalm 69 verse 9, it says, your zeal, the zeal for your house has eaten me up. The idea that to be zealous for God's house motivates us to try to protect God's house and then protect the integrity of God's house. Does God need protecting? Of course not. And yet he issues this charge to us to safeguard those things that are holy that he's entrusted to us. The word kana, that is kuf, nun, aleph, also means jealous. Zealous or jealous. As in when God says, I am a jealous God. And so there is a connection with between being jealous and then the zeal that accompanies it. Jealousy is connected to proper zeal. And so in this particular case, God is a jealous husband, and a jealous husband does not want his wife or his betrothed consorting with a harlot. And if she does, then that enrages him. And you see this zeal expressed through that rage because he's jealous for he's acting to protect what is his. And depending on the circumstances, how he acts might appear very harsh, but it is a result of his jealousy where his people are concerned. He's a jealous God. He does not want us consorting with any other lovers. And we can understand that, can't we? Right? So then he will act. But we also must acknowledge that jealousy and zeal is a two-edged sword. It can cut both ways. Now, obviously not on God's part, because everything he does is true, righteous, and just. But when it comes to you and to me, there is a positive connotation attached to jealousy, if we're jealous for the right reasons and for the right things, and also the zeal that can be expressed through that. But it can cut the other way, because where you and I are concerned, if we're not careful, our jealousy and our zeal has the potential to destroy. And so that word kuf nun aleph is a family word. It's related to this next word, which is kana, which does mean to acquire. Okay? It's basically pronounced the same way. Instead of the aleph at the end, it has the hey at the end. But here's why I wanted you to see this. Because from this word, kana, we get this name here. Cain. Cain. Because if you go back and read, she says, I have acquired a man from the Lord. But now, why is that important for us? Because Cain is the first recorded murderer. He's the first recorded liar, actually. Where's your brother? I don't know. Yeah, he did. Right? So he's trying to, I don't know what you're talking about. It's funny, that seems to be going around a lot today. People say this and do that, and somebody call them on, no, I didn't say that, I didn't do that. Anyway, let me get off of that real quick. Anyhow, this man murdered his brother, and why? Jealousy. So he was jealous, he was enraged, and in his zeal, he went out and murdered his brother. So we'll look at it a different way. There are people, have always been, will forever be until the Messiah returns and sets everything straight. There have been people, even well-meaning people, who have a zeal for the things of God. At least that's how they see it. And this zeal they have for the things of God, as they understand it, has often rendered destruction and sometimes ends up working against God's purpose. For example, there's a man by the name of Saul of Tarsus who, when he's Paul, said this of himself in Philippians 3:6, concerning zeal, persecuting the church. And so his zeal for hey, Bill. Peace and love. Okay. Good to see you. So his zeal for the Torah, his zeal for the things of God as he translated it, provoked him to go and to persecute the very people who were trying to promote and advance the will of God. And so it's critical that our zeal, and this is the point of that our zeal be tempered with wisdom. We should always temper our zeal with wisdom, lest we are seduced into reacting to a situation as opposed to responding to a situation. And so I'll ask you a question. I'm not asking you to answer it necessarily out loud, but I want you to think about this. Did Pinchas react to something, or did he respond to it? Do you understand what I'm asking? Sometimes we react to things on an impulse, out of anger, out of fear, this, that, and the other. But then if wisdom enters into the picture, I would suggest to you that lends to responding. Because when we respond to something, we respond to it appropriately, justly, temperately. Reaction, in my view anyway, my opinion is, again, as I've said many times before, every time I've made a decision or said something when I was angry or when my emotions were ramped up, I've never gone back and thought that was a great idea. It's almost always a really bad idea. I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have done that. Because all I've done now is to throw another log or two on a fire that I don't want to burn. So it's appropriate to respond to situations. So I'm going to give you my opinion based on God's assessment of the situation. I think Pinchas responded to a situation, because he's well aware of all the events that have led up to this and how it is continuing to grow, how it's continuing to permeate the congregation and threaten his family. So I will kind of move on from this to something else by saying this. The motive for our actions will always produce the appropriate fruit. If we react to something prematurely in the wrong heart and mind attitude, that fruit will become evident. But if we allow wisdom to do its work and we respond to a situation appropriately, the fruit will be there to justify that or to validate that. Now, I know that there are people in the body who would absolutely relish the opportunity to exhibit the same level of zeal that Pinchas did. And what I mean by that, there are some people who say, get me a javelin. You know it's true. Now, I'm not going to look around the room at anybody. But, keep this in mind. There is another man in Scripture who, in his zeal, took a javelin with the intent of running somebody else through. But that man was motivated by jealousy. And his intended victim was a man that God said is a man after my own heart. So the point is, we need to be careful. It is typical for us to, as I said, emphasize Pinchas' actions and his zeal for God, and that's why, I've got that kind of zeal. Great. But let's always make certain to temper it with wisdom. But when we come to this portion, we always kind of look at Pinchas and what he did and why he did it and those things that God said about it. But I want to do something else for just a little bit here. I want us to kind of put ourselves on the other side of the equation. I want us to consider the other side, and by that I mean Zimri of Cozbi. Because it could be argued that these two people exhibited a certain level of zeal as well, just for the wrong things. So chapter 25, verse 14. Now, the name of the Israelite who was killed with the Midianite woman, was Zimri, the son of Salu, a leader of a father's house among the Simeonites. So a notable person. And the name of the Midianite woman who was killed was Cozbi, the daughter of Sur. And again, the tradition is he was a prince and she was the princess. He was head of the people of a father's house in Midian. So there it is. So also a notable person. Now let's look quickly at Zimri. He was of the tribe of Simeon. And if you know your Bible, Simeon is a tribe with a lot of troubling history. They don't have the best reputation. Sorry about that, tribe of Simeon. No reflection on you whatsoever. No. Look at it this way. You're redeeming the name, all right? You're redeeming Simeon here, okay? You have a great opportunity, right? And Simeon is going to be allotted his portion in the kingdom. So there's always reconciliation and restoration. But anyway, it's just is what it is. Simeon's history is a little, it was Simeon along with Levi who murdered the men of Shechem when their sister Dinah was abused. Simeon was involved with that. And in fact, Jacob got very upset and determined that Simeon, Levi, you guys don't need to hang out with one another. You need to go over there and you need to go over there. In fact, Simeon is kind of assimilated into Judah for the most part when they get into the land. Simeon was held by Joseph because he was one of the main brothers who wanted Joseph dead. So it sounds like he's a very zealous kind of a guy, right? And then remember that Simeon camped with Reuben. Well, why is that important? Because Dathan and Abiram were from Reuben. And so Simeon and Reuben are kind of hanging out. So apparently Simeon don't need to hang out with anybody, really. You're redeeming the name. You're redeeming it. So we could make the argument that Zimri's family environment was not that healthy. Because we could say that maybe given its history, there's all these attitudes of the past, these words, these accusations, and all these things that took root in the family and then got passed down to the children, and it kind of shaped who they were, what they thought, how they approached things, their outlook on life. And let's face it, that happens. It happens. That's why redemption is such a beautiful thing. Because like it or not, we learn from our environment. I know that everybody in this room understands what I'm talking about, except the younger people, perhaps. But when I was young, I loved my dad, I respected my dad, but there were things about my dad I did not want to replicate. In fact, I told myself, I'm never going to do that. I'll never do that. I'll never say that. I'll never act like that. And by golly, the older I get, it's like, oh my word, that was my dad. And as I look in the mirror, I'm like, oh my word, that's my dad. Just a little more hair. How does that happen? Because we are trained, we're influenced by our environment. This gets passed down, like it or not. We inherit things from our parents, both good and bad. And then we tend to pass some of those things along. And some of those bad things really need to stop with us, right? We need to arrest that. Because if we're not careful, we're just going to propagate things down through the generations. And we're talking about things that really aren't conducive to life, all right? Then we have this. What one generation coddles and tolerates, the next generation will indulge. They'll take it to the extreme. So what I'm getting at is that kind of a situation is probably, most likely anyway, how a Zimri is produced. I don't think that he woke up that day and decided to be that way. I think this is something that started many years before, because he represents somebody who is either really, really stupid, and that's possible, or somebody who is just cold and hard-hearted toward the things of God. I tend to discount the idea that he just did this in the heat of the moment. Maybe that, kind of gave him the opportunity, but these were things that were brewing in his heart, it seems to me anyway, for a long time. And maybe because these are the kinds of things that had been brewing in his family for a while. In other words, the pieces were already in place when the seduction came along. I guess if that is true, and I'll put a if on that, but if that is true, it might also be that there was something going on in Eve and Adam that just, when they were given the opportunity, it just exploited that. That's a question. I'm not saying that with any certainty. It just makes me wonder. So how hard-hearted, how selfish, and how blind do you have to be in order to think that doing something the way he did, or like he did, or what he did, and especially after witnessing what happened to Korah and Dathan and Aviram and all those 250 notable men and all the stuff that happened after that, how blind do you have to be to think that this is a good idea? There's something going on in the man's heart. And so all these things are going on. You've got these people bowing down to the Baal of Peor. They provoke a plague. The plague is sweeping through the land and through the camp. And then these two people come in and they flaunt their sin in God's face, almost, as I said, daring God to take action. Now, where Cozbi is concerned, by the way, her name means literally my lie, L-I-E, my deception. Maybe, since she was a Midianite princess, would have been ignorant of the risk that she was taking. In other words, she didn't have this interaction and relationship with the God of Israel. Maybe she thought their God was just like our gods, nothing. So maybe she was ignorant. Maybe she was deceived. Maybe she had kind of bought into a lie, which then leads me to this. It is dangerous for us to be ignorant or to be indifferent to God's ways. Paul in Romans talks about how the people of the world have no excuse because through created things, the Creator speaks and no one has any excuse. And so it is, again, it's dangerous to be ignorant, to be indifferent to God's ways. It's dangerous to believe a lie. Deception, lies, lying signs and wonders, these are the things that in the New Testament that Paul, Messiah, and others keep going to, that this is the thing that God's people need to be on guard for in these last days. Not who the Antichrist is, but what the spirit of Antichrist do. He lies. He's a liar. He's the father of it. Speaking of the adversary, a murderer from the beginning. And he lies. And when he tells a lie, he speaks of his own resources. Don't believe the lie. Now, maybe she was ignorant, but Zimri was not. He knew better. He knew better. He had witnessed all these things. And so he was very belligerent. And so it's very dangerous to be belligerent, to be blatantly rebellious, and then to turn around and lead the ignorant into something they may not really have any awareness of. But in the end, both were guilty of a very gross disrespect for God and for his house. Unless he was just really, really stupid. It's just hard for me to imagine that he would have thought by doing this that everything was going to turn out right. In other words, I don't think he does this expecting to die, because if he did, he was stupid. I don't see that. So then, in his rebellious state of mind, in his zeal, he either didn't care that he may die, or maybe it was just that he was incapable of discerning that, and I tend to believe the latter. He just couldn't discern that, couldn't imagine that. Couldn't imagine that anybody's going to do anything about it. Maybe he's that arrogant. Psalm 10 verse 4 says this: the wicked does not seek God. God is in none of his thoughts. In other words, he wasn't thinking of God. He wasn't thinking of God's ways, God's principles, and how God might respond, because God is not in the thoughts of those who are wicked. So then, this lack of consideration for the ways of God may be fueled with the belief that nobody's going to do anything about it anyway, which is largely true in our day and time. That idea and that thinking prompts blatant rebellion in society. People will do what they will because they expect that there will be no response from authority. People at large, and we'll need to include ourselves in this, people at large take God's mercy for granted. There are people in this world, unfortunately within the body, who discuss within their mind, how close can I get to the edge before God acts? You know it's true. I don't know about you, but I don't want to find out what the line is, right? Because this man and this, well, the man particularly, but the woman as well, obviously crossed a line. So then again, people will do what they will because they believe there will be no response from authority. And I would add to that, there are some in authority who enable this kind of behavior, either by indifference or sometimes it serves their own purposes. You know, like, what was that term I heard the other day from Bibi Netanyahu? Useful idiots. Okay? Oh, Bill, I don't like that word. It's in the dictionary. Okay? Useful idiots. Also, in our godlessness, we don't take responsibility for anything. It's always somebody else's fault. Yeah, but if I am trying to temper zeal with wisdom right now. I recently had someone send me an email in regard to something that they had done that was very destructive. And they came to realize that. And so they were sending me an email to acknowledge that. But then they ended it this way. But if you only had done this, it started out, if I did this, please forgive me. But I wouldn't have done that if only you had done this, which is something that actually was none of their business. Okay. Do you see what I'm saying? It's either we take responsibility for it or we don't. And it is our tendency as human beings that when we are faced with things and the consequences of things that we do or say, what have you, it is in us to not take responsibility. Have you eaten from the tree that I told you not to eat? Well, yeah, but the woman you gave me, she gave me this fruit, and I took it and I ate it. Did you do this? Why did you do that? Well, the serpent beguiled me. It started from the beginning. It's not natural for us to take responsibility. It's always someone else's fault. All of us are guilty of this. All of us fall into this trap, and we need to stop that. If it's our responsibility, let's embrace it. Because to always say it's somebody else's fault, if I wouldn't have done that, if you hadn't have done this, cultivates a mindset and a lifestyle that pushes rebellion to the next level. You end up with a Zimri. You end up with people bowing to the Baal of Peor. And when that continues to build, it's only a matter of time. It is inevitable before God acts. He will respond. So I would say that our society, and certainly the body, more so the body, we need to demonstrate that there are consequences for certain actions. There is no point in having laws if there are no consequences for breaking those laws. What's the point, right? There is no point in having boundaries if whatever thou wilt is to be the standard. And if bad behavior is tolerated again and again and again and again, the entire society is going to be affected by that same spirit. Look out your window, turn on your television, read your newspaper, or we don't read newspapers anymore, read your phone. All you have to do is just look for 2 minutes, and you'll see exactly what we're talking about here. And if we continue, in the world, by enabling lawlessness to the degree that we now see, it's going to continue to spread, and eventually it's only a matter of time before it will spawn the lawless one. And we don't need to participate in that. Now, I know that you already know all these things. Nevertheless, there are some lessons for us. We come back around to this Torah portion again this year. There's some lessons that we need to just be reminded of, need to be reaffirmed and reinforced. Number one, we need to respect God and his ways. We need to respect God and his house. We need to respect the boundaries and the principles that he has ordained. We need to be ready and willing to take responsibility for our actions. I've said this many times, and I will say it many more times. Gentlemen, husbands, fathers, what goes on in your house, everything that goes on there may not be your fault, but it is your responsibility. What goes on in this house, everything that happens, may not be my fault. Now, I know that others have differing opinions on that, but everything may not be my fault, but it is my responsibility. That's the way it works. So we need to be ready and willing to take responsibility for our actions and quit pointing fingers at, but if that person or if that guy or if she and all these things. And also, we need to be ready and willing to accept the consequences of our actions without a cruddy attitude. We need to be willing to do that because our ability or willingness to accept the consequences and with the right attitude and with the notion that I don't want to repeat these mistakes is evidence that wisdom is at work. Because the wise student will receive correction. The Bible says, and I'm going to use this word, a fool does not receive correction and instruction. And so if we wish to be wise, then we have to be willing, ready, even anxious, to receive God's instruction and correction. And it's going to sting and it's going to hurt, but he chastens those that he loves, right? We don't want to find out what he does to those he hates, right? Or their actions, maybe I should put it that way, they're those actions that he hates. We need to be learning how to be better about responding rather than reacting. And when we do decide it's time to take action, and I'll be the first to admit that one of the things that I do, my MO when it comes to certain situations, it drives my wife crazy, is because I wait. And the reason I wait typically is because I get mad. I get angry. And sometimes I get really angry that I have conversations with trees. You're right? You've heard me talk about that. I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but it is real because I would rather the tree hear what I have to say when I'm angry than for anybody else. And some of those trees are dying. Anyway, I try to discipline myself not to react. I'm not saying I do that well every time, but that is something that a long time ago, I knew I need to do this. And I hope to be better about responding. And so then, add to that this. When we do decide that it is time to take action, we need to be careful of what we use for our justification. That carnal side that wants to creep out every once in a while will lie to you. It will lie to you. We need to be careful about what we use for our justification because assumptions are commonly wrong. And those wrong assumptions will lead us to make bad decisions. And some of those bad decisions can have disastrous results. So then, I want to consider on that note that we all have the potential to be Zimri or Cozbi. And I don't mean that we all are going to go out and do something so blatantly perverse as they did in God's house. That is not what I mean. But I mean this. Every one of us, starting with me, have at one time or the other misbehaved, and sometimes misbehaved badly in respect to God and to his house. Can we agree on that? Okay. Handful of you. Starting with me. Okay? Starting with me. In other words, we all have the propensity to do what we want to do and then justify doing what we did or what we said. Now, I want to say this carefully because I don't want to be accused of saying something I'm not. But, there are politicians that are exceptions to the rule. There are men and women out there who I think are honestly, sincerely trying to serve the people. So let me say that first. But on average, politicians are a prime example of what not to do. And that is, they'll say something and then they're called on it. I didn't say that. When they do something and they're called on it, I didn't do that. I wasn't the border czar. What are you talking about? All right, Lord, I apologize for that one. Anyway, pretending, that I didn't do that, not taking responsibility. And then lying like this, they lead Cozbi down the path to destruction. The ignorant, the ones who are believing the lie, the ones who are susceptible, the ones who are ignorant of certain things. So, again, there are exceptions to that. But, we see these things right in front of us. And it's like God's showing us this. This is what I'm talking about. Don't do that. And we don't need to do that. So, I'm going to take that and springboard into this. That's what not to do. Here's some other things that we don't, as his people, need to do. We don't need to speak and act any differently in public than we do in private. And how we speak in public and private matters. Let me be a little more specific. Don't be quoting me scripture. Don't run around speaking in tongues and in the next breath with the same mouth use foul, vulgar language. There's no excuse for that. If you are inclined to display fits of rage or inconsideration for others in public, will you please take off the sticker that says, I'm a follower of Jesus or a follower of Yeshua? Will you take that off, please? And while you're at it, take off the Jacob's tent sticker too. Okay? That does not need to happen. We are being watched. And we should not be accused of being guilty of the same thing that the world is guilty of. We do not need to bring reproach upon the name of the Lord. And by that, and connected to that, we don't really need to bring reproach on your fellow congregants because you decided that I'm justified in acting the way I want to act. We need to get over those kinds of things. Let me dig a little deeper here. I guess this hole I'm going to be in probably in a moment. If you're one who proudly displays tzitzit in public, and because you want others to see that you are a follower of Messiah, good for you. But if you do that, please make sure you're not acting like the devil. By the way, that connects to the notion of having the doctrine of Balaam by casting a stumbling block before your brother. In a similar vein, if you wear tzitzit on the edge of a Megadeth t-shirt, you're sending out confusing and mixed messages. Because one, the tzitzit is to remind us to keep commands that lead to life. And the other literally has the word death in it. All right? Now, I know that's a little extreme, but I've seen it. Okay? But hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say here. What we present needs to be consistent, and it needs to be authentic, and it needs to reflect Him, His house, His purpose, His word. And so on that note, I want to dig a little deeper. We're going to briefly touch on the topic of modesty for men and for women. Would it not be an understatement to say that Zimri and Cozbi were immodest and acted immodestly? Yes, that's an understatement. We would never do such a thing. I know that. But guess what? It didn't start out that way. It started as something long before that. And so as God's people, we need to uphold a standard of modesty as His people. Now, I'll pick on me, because if I pick on me, then maybe some people won't get offended. Everybody that's been at Jacob's tent for any length of time knows that I do not go to the beach. I've made it very, very clear. I hate it, I loathe it, I abhor the beach. And it's not just because of the sand and the sun. It's because I don't want to have to deal with the things that I know are going to be there. Because there are a lot of immodest people in this world, right? And during the summer, they like to show up at the beach. I don't want to have to deal with that. You know what? Because I'm a guy, all right? And I know that some of you guys are so spiritual. Oh, Lord, that doesn't bother me, not at all. You liar. I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to be there. Because if I go to the beach, I know that I'm going to see things that 50 years ago, people would have been arrested for indecency. And now it's normal. All the older people are clapping, the young people are going, "Hurr." And by the way, that's not just the women. It's the men too. The men's swimwear is getting skimpy. Hey, I don't want to look at that. I don't want to deal with that. Good gracious. Man. Nobody wants to see that. Now, the women will say, well, men just need to train their eyes and control their lust. Absolutely, they should. Absolutely, they should. That's absolutely right. But at the same time, it is wrong to place a stumbling block before your brother, whether it's men or women. If it's true with other things, then it's true with how we present ourselves. When Adam and Eve's eyes were opened and they realized they were naked, what were they at that point? They were ashamed. They were ashamed of their nakedness. God realized that. What did God do? He covered their nakedness. He covered their shame. What did He use to cover their shame? Clothes. Clothes. Listen to what God tells the priests when they come into His house. Exodus 28, verse 42 and 3. And you shall make for them linen trousers to cover their nakedness. They shall reach from the waist to the thighs. They shall be on Aaron and on his sons when they come into the tabernacle of meeting, or when they come near the altar to minister in the holy place, that they do not incur iniquity and die. What is God saying? Cover up. You know, more importantly, I'm holy. You strive for holiness. And that includes being modest in our speech, in our how we present ourselves, how we appear in public and in private. Again, this instruction is given not because he's just some mean God, some prudish God. He is a holy God. And those who desire to approach him must strive to be a holy people. And let me be the first to say, I have not arrived. I have not. I still stumble and struggle with things at times, but I continue to strive for that. I haven't attained, as Paul said, but I am pressing toward the mark. And in doing that, sometimes I stumble and fall. But nevertheless, we have to get back up and we have to press toward that mark because he's called us to be a holy people, even as he is holy. And so even if we stumble, even if we struggle, sometimes you have to kind of process things. I realize, nevertheless, it is a standard that he has set before us, and we need to apply that principle to every facet of our walk. I'll put it this way. In whatever the situation and scenario that we may need to address, we need to clean up before Pinchas shows up. Here's what God said of Pinchas. He turned back my wrath, and in doing that, he saved countless numbers of people. Rabbinical commentary says that Pinchas acted in the spirit of Elijah. Because remember, Elijah's zeal for the God of Israel provoked him to have all the prophets of Baal and all the prophets of Ashtaroth put to death. Seemingly rather harsh, right? But at that time, what was Israel doing? They were sending out a mixed message. They had tzitzit on their Megadeth t-shirt. They were worshiping the God of Israel, but on their way to worship him, they were stopping off at at the temples of Baal and the temples of Ashtaroth. And that is what Elijah addressed. And so he made it very clear, or God through him made it very clear, that this cannot abide. This cannot continue. You know, we know this. We're in this world, but we're not of this world. And we are here to be a light to the people, a light to the nations, and we cannot be a light to the nations if we are acting like the nations. But what you're describing in some of these things, Bill, sounds old-fashioned and prudish. So be it. So far from committing murder, Pinchas preserved life. Psalm 106, verse 30 and 31. Then Pinchas stood up and intervened, and the plague was stopped. And that was accounted to him for righteousness to all generations forevermore. Now, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted unto him as righteousness. Apparently, Pinchas believed God too, in that God is holy, and this should not occur in his house. And what he did was accounted unto him for righteousness to all generations forevermore. Think about that. That means ours. That means you and me right here today. His example, not taking a javelin and running somebody through, but having a zeal for God's house. That's what God recognized. He has my zeal, it said, and he has turned back my wrath. So he rose up, he acted because he was zealous for the things of God. And you and I, as his people, need to be zealous for the things of God. And I've asked myself this question. I will continue to do this, but I want you to do this as well. Ask yourself, what are you really zealous for? What consumes your thoughts, your time, your energy, your focus? And whatever that is, and be honest with yourself, because yourself will lie to you. It will deceive you and seduce you into believing something that isn't true. But be honest with yourself. What has your attention? What takes up all your energy? What are you zealous for? And if it is not for God in his house, trouble's afoot. And that needs to be addressed. That needs to be corrected. And this time in which we live, it's always been true, but it's critical at this point. Because not only are the people of this world bowing to unspeakable things, but unfortunately that attitude and mindset has crept into the body. And for political expediency or being relevant in relation to the culture and society, we tolerate certain things that we should not. So again, I'll say, starting with me, we need to clean up before Pinchas shows up. And hopefully you understand what I mean by that. We are here to protect what God has entrusted to us. Righteous zeal is an attribute of the Creator, and that should be emulated. Zeal is good when it is used for a good purpose and with the right motivation. Again, do not read into that you have been authorized by me to go out and to neutralize somebody you think that is acting up, because the righteous zeal is always tempered with wisdom. Amen? I'll ask again. Righteous zeal should always be tempered with wisdom. Is that not so? Okay. So when we emulate and exhibit righteous zeal, and it's tempered with wisdom, I would suggest to you that goes hand in glove with the true worshipers who worship him in spirit, zeal, and in truth, wisdom. Balance is good. Balance is good. And balance is connected to this right here, being able to hear, right? Hear, O Israel. Now, on the other hand, zeal for idolatry, which in our day and time is so often ourselves. When we indulge ourselves, serve ourselves, we are idolizing ourselves. And so zeal for idolatry and zeal for immoral behavior threatens the character of a people. And that kind of zeal can, and if we're not careful, it will permeate the attitude of others that are in the body. A stinky attitude kind of spreads, right? Then we have this. There are people on the outside, like the Midianites, who were so zealous for the destruction of Israel that they were committed to giving up their daughters to harlotry. Can you imagine? Can you imagine somebody so filled with hate that they're willing to do something like that? Oh, how I'm tempted to say something right now. Zeal tempered with wisdom. The wicked will go to great lengths to undermine the integrity of God's people. And so then, knowing that, their zeal for evil has to be matched with a zeal for righteousness. I'd go so far to say it needs to be outmatched with a zeal for righteousness. Because remember when Messiah, he went into the temple courtyard and he saw the money changers there and they were doing all these things, and he took the time to fashion a whip. I mean, a little time passed. I don't think somebody had a whip laying over there. I don't know. But it says, I think he fashioned a whip. So he took the time. He's thinking about this. And what is he thinking about? I'm going to get these guys. And he went in there and he took that whip. He chased them out. And a lot of people thought that was harsh. But his concern was and is for the body. He had a zeal for his Father's house. And he was going to protect what had been entrusted to him, and that includes his body, you and me. And he acted in a way that can make the body whole. So in what Yeshua did, it was much better than what Pinchas did, because God, through the Messiah, made atonement for God's people. And so the point of that is this, and I was almost done here, but I will conclude with this. You and I, in this day and age in which we live, if you are not aware of this, things are pretty crazy right now. We thought they were crazy last year. We thought they were crazy 5 years ago or even before that. It's insane right now. It's insanity to what is going on in this world. And unfortunately, there's so many in this world that are either ignorant or just don't care. And so the stage is being set for you and I to be vigorously standing against corruption, standing against wickedness, standing against immorality. And because you see what's going to happen, this immorality and all these things are going on. It's like a plague that is sweeping through the whole world. And you and I have the opportunity to stand up and to stem the tide, to stem the spread of the plague that is working its way, not only through the world, but unfortunately has come into the body. But our motivation should always be with a genuine concern for God's house, God's people, to uphold his standards and not advance our own interest or our own agenda. We need to emulate his justice and righteousness and not our self-righteousness. Amen? Our zeal needs to be tempered with the wisdom that comes from him.